Winter 1942. Britain was still a nation of bomb sites. Walk through London, Coventry, Liverpool or Plymouth, and the scars of the Blitz remained everywhere. Jagged skeletal walls, hollowed churches, endless rows of shattered windows patched with tape or cardboard. For 22 months, from September 1940 until May 1941, the Luftwaffe had come by night, their bomb loads falling on docks, rail yards and civilian districts alike. By the time Hitler turned eastward toward Russia, more than 40,000 British civilians were dead and over 1 million houses destroyed. The Royal Air Force had survived the onslaught, but barely, and Bomber Command carried the bruises of a long, inconclusive campaign. For the men who flew at night in 1941, the war often felt futile. Losses were heavy, navigation unreliable, bombing results dismal. Post-raid reconnaissance revealed that fewer than 1 in 4 crews dropped within 5 miles of the intended target. Some raids scattered across the countryside, others missed cities entirely. The German war machine, from the perspective of British factory workers who endured rationing and nightly alarms, seemed untouched. Morale sagged. Britain needed not merely survival, but a way to strike back. It was in this bleak context that Air Marshal Arthur Travers Harris assumed command of Bomber Command in February 1942. Stocky, blunt, and utterly convinced of his mission, Harris was a product of both the Great War and the interwar RAF debates about the future of air power. He carried with him the belief that strategic bombing could shatter the enemy's will, that steel and fire delivered from the air could succeed where armies had bled into stalemate in 1914-18. The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion, he declared, that they were going to bomb everyone else, and nobody was going to bomb them. His mission was to correct that delusion. Harris inherited an organisation that was far from ready to deliver the crushing blows he envisioned. Bomber Command in early 1942 fielded barely 400 operational heavy bombers, Handley Page Halifaxes, Avro Manchesters and the 1st Lancasters, supplemented by twin-engine Wellingtons and ageing Whitleys. Training standards were uneven, navigation aids primitive, bombing accuracy lamentable. But Harris saw a way forward. He championed new technology like the GEE radio navigation system, which promised to guide bombers far more precisely than dead reckoning. He pushed for concentration rather than dispersal, recognizing that isolated aircraft simply invited destruction by night fighters. Above all, he believed in scale. To overwhelm German defences, Britain would have to launch raids not by dozens or even hundreds, but by 1,000 bombers at once. It was an audacious idea, almost reckless given the RAF's resources. The arithmetic seemed impossible. At the start of 1942, Bomber Command had perhaps 400 heavy bombers ready for operations. Even if everyone flew, which weather, mechanical failures and enemy action ensured they would not, the total fell far short. But Harris, in his characteristic bluntness, told his superiors that the numbers could be made to work. Operational squadrons alone were insufficient, but what if every aircraft in training units was pressed into service? What if Coastal Command's Wellingtons, usually tasked with patrolling the seas, were diverted for one night? What if everything with wings that could carry bombs was summoned? The plan that took shape in spring 1942 was called Operation Millennium. Its purpose was as much psychological as military. Harris wanted to prove to a doubting British government, to sceptical allies, and to Germany itself that Bomber Command could deliver devastation on a scale never before seen. If it succeeded, it would silence critics who claimed the bomber offensive was wasteful and inaccurate. If it failed, it might cripple his command's credibility for the remainder of the war. The question then became, where should such a blow fall? Harris and his planners considered several German cities, weighing reach, industrial importance, and navigational feasibility. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, beckoned, but its flak and night fighter defences were formidable. Berlin, symbolic capital of Nazism, was too distant for many aircraft. Hamburg, Essen, and Düsseldorf were all on the list. But one city stood out: Cologne. Perched on the Rhine, Cologne was the fourth largest city in Germany, with a population of nearly 700,000. Its factories produced everything from chemicals and armaments to electrical equipment. Its rail yards served as a vital transportation hub for the Ruhr. And symbolically, Cologne was ancient and proud, home to a Gothic cathedral whose twin spires dominated the skyline, a jewel of German culture. Destroying large portions of Cologne would demonstrate not only military reach, but the ability to humble the German homeland itself. Crucially, Cologne lay just within comfortable range of most British bombers. From bases in eastern England, even the short-legged Wellingtons could reach the target and return. The new GEE navigation aid could guide crews directly to the Rhine Valley. And by choosing Cologne, Harris ensured that Bomber Command would be attacking a city with both industrial and psychological weight. The challenge remained: how to assemble 1,000 bombers for a single night's work. The RAF's operational strength alone could not provide them. Harris combed through every unit. Training schools contributed aircraft, their young crews thrust into combat missions for the first time. Coastal Command released bombers normally dedicated to anti-submarine patrols. Even obsolescent types, some considered unfit for frontline use, were pressed back into service for this one demonstration of strength. The final tally astonished even insiders. More than 50 bomber stations across England would be involved, launching in a carefully timed sequence to funnel aircraft into a bomber stream that would pass over Cologne in a concentrated 90 minutes. Instead of trickling arrivals, which allowed defenders to intercept one by one, Harris's mass would overwhelm radar controllers and saturate flak batteries. It was a new way of thinking about night bombing, mass as protection, scale as a weapon in itself. Harris understood the stakes. Operation Millennium was a gamble on the future of British strategy. If Cologne burned, it would prove that bombing could shake German cities just as the Blitz had scarred Britain. It would demonstrate to the Americans, only now entering the war in strength, that the RAF had found a way to carry the war directly into Germany. It would rally British morale by showing that, after years of defence and survival, they could now strike back with unprecedented power. By late May 1942, the pieces were in place. Crews briefed, aircraft fueled, navigation aids calibrated, target folders distributed. From Cornwall to Yorkshire, airfields prepared for the great launch. For the men who would fly, it promised to be a mission unlike any other, an aerial armada so vast that even veterans could scarcely imagine it. For Harris, it was the first step in proving his doctrine of strategic air power. For Cologne, it was the calm before 90 minutes of fire. The plan looked bold on paper, 1,000 bombers in the air on a single night. But in early 1942, Bomber Command could not field even half that number on a routine operation. A typical raid then launched 150 to 200 aircraft, sometimes fewer, and often less than two-thirds reached the target. Yet Air Marshal Harris insisted the figure was achievable. To his superiors in the air staff, he promised a spectacular demonstration of offensive strength. Behind the confidence, his staff scrambled to conjure the numbers. The math was merciless. On May 1st, 1942, Bomber Command had 416 operational heavies available. Factoring in maintenance, weather, and aircrew fatigue, no more than 300 could be relied upon for any single night. To reach 1,000, Harris demanded every possible source of aircraft: operational training units, coastal command, even aircraft slated for retirement. Every kite with wings, he ordered, is to be found and flown. The most controversial element was the use of training units. These operational training units, or OTUS, housed crews still learning their trade. Most had flown only practice sorties, navigating over British terrain or dropping practice bombs on deserted ranges. Now, Harris demanded they join the main force. It was a risk. Many of these pilots had fewer than a dozen hours in their aircraft type. Their navigators were still mastering GEE, the new radio navigation system. Their gunners had never faced live tracer rounds. Yet Harris judged the spectacle worth the gamble. For one night, training would end in Cologne's searchlit sky. The OTUs alone contributed nearly 350 aircraft. Many were Wellingtons, a twin-engine bomber designed before the war and already eclipsed by the four-engine heavyweights. Still, the Wellington's geodesic frame could absorb punishment, and its range was sufficient for Cologne. To fill the gap, Coastal Command released 49 aircraft, stripping patrols from the Atlantic convoy lanes. Even retired types appeared. Hamptons, Whitleys, and a handful of Blenheims, aircraft more suited to 1940 than 1942. They would contribute little in bomb weight, but they added to the magic number: 1,000. The final order of battle read like a catalogue of British aviation. Of the 1,047 bombers dispatched on May 30th, 1942, 602 were Wellingtons, 131 Halifaxes, 73 Lancasters, 49 Stirlings, 88 Whitleys, 50 Hamptons, and a scattering of Blenheims and Manchesters. The disparity in performance was vast. A Stirling could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs, a Blenheim scarcely 1,000. But the total mattered more than the weight. Harris wanted headlines, and the phrase 1,000 bombers would electrify both friend and foe. The logistics of launching so vast a fleet were staggering. 54 bomber stations across Britain would be involved. Air Vice Marshal Robert Saundby, Harris's deputy, orchestrated the timetable with mathematical precision. Each squadron would take off in sequence, feeding into a great aerial conveyor belt across the North Sea. Timing was critical. If the bombers arrived piecemeal, German night fighters could pick them off in detail. If they arrived en masse, Cologne's defences might be swamped. Saundby's innovation was the bomber stream. Instead of scattering aircraft across the night sky, the force would pass over the target in a compressed wave, a narrow corridor of hundreds of bombers, nose to tail, over 90 minutes. The concept was untested, but it promised to saturate German radar and overwhelm searchlights. For the crews, the build-up was both routine and unprecedented. Ground staff laboured for days to prepare aircraft, fuelling, loading bombs, checking engines. Each Lancaster carried a mix of high explosives and incendiaries, designed not only to shatter buildings, but to ignite them. Cologne's dense medieval centre was particularly vulnerable to fire. At briefing, crews were told the objective: cripple the industrial heart of the Rhine and demonstrate to Germany that no city was safe. Maps highlighted the target area: rail yards, factories, and oil installations. But Harris made no secret of the larger aim: to shatter civilian morale, to replicate on German soil the terror Britain had endured in the Blitz. The human element was harder to marshal. Many crews understood they were part of something historic. Rumours of the 1,000 bomber raid had circulated for weeks, and the scale of preparation confirmed them. For veterans, the thought of so many aircraft in one stream was both exhilarating and terrifying. Collision, mid-air confusion, and the chaos of target approach loomed in every mind. For trainees, it was baptism by fire. "We hadn't even finished our course," recalled one young pilot from number 22 OTU. "Suddenly we were told we were flying to Cologne. None of us had seen flak before. We knew some wouldn't come back." In Germany, meanwhile, the defenders sensed little. Cologne had endured sporadic raids since 1940, but nothing beyond 100 aircraft at a time. Civil defence drills continued, blackouts enforced, and flak towers manned. Yet the city of 700,000 remained largely intact. Factories hummed, trams ran, children attended school. The cathedral still dominated the skyline, an ancient reassurance. On the night of May 30th, most citizens expected only another siren, another raid like dozens before. Few imagined what was coming: 1,000 bombers converging in the dark, a storm of steel and fire compressed into 90 minutes. By late May, everything was ready. Harris had his numbers, Saundby his timetable, the crews their briefings. The weather forecast promised clear skies over the Rhine. On the afternoon of May 30th, stations across England vibrated with activity. Engines warming, bombs trundled from stores, navigators plotting routes. At dusk, pilots strapped in, ground crews swung propellers, and the first aircraft rolled down the runways. From Yorkshire to Norfolk, Cornwall to Lincolnshire, the great exodus began. Searchlights at British stations swept across the darkening sky as one by one aircraft climbed into the night. Farmers looked up from their fields to see a procession of navigation lights streaming eastward, more planes than most had ever imagined. The drone of engines merged into a single rolling thunder. The 1,000-bomber raid was no longer a plan. It was airborne, heading for Cologne. By midnight on the 30th of May 1942, Cologne slept uneasily under blackout. The sirens had not yet sounded, though a faint hum on the horizon unsettled a few listeners. At first it seemed like another raid of a few dozen bombers, the kind the city had endured many times. But the hum grew, layer upon layer, until it became a rolling thunder. For those awake, it was a sound unlike any before, the noise of 1,000 engines converging. At 00:47 hours, the first Pathfinder aircraft dropped flares to mark the aiming point near the city centre. Almost simultaneously, air raid sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their positions, searchlights flicked on, and thousands of civilians descended into shelters or basements. But the scale of what followed defied every expectation. The bomber stream arrived in a tightly packed wave. Instead of scattered aircraft appearing over the course of hours, hundreds of RAF bombers poured into the sky above Cologne in the span of minutes. The German night fighter system, built to track and intercept small formations, faltered. Radar operators saw only a massive blur. Controllers shouted orders in vain as too many blips crowded their screens. By the time night fighters scrambled, the sky above Cologne was already saturated with flares and falling bombs. At 00:48, the first high-explosive bombs crashed into the city. They tore open roofs, smashed water mains and cratered streets, clearing the way for the incendiaries that followed. Within minutes, whole blocks of timber-framed houses were ablaze. Incendiaries rained in by the thousands, magnesium and phosphorus sticks sparking fires wherever they landed. Fire brigades rushed into action, but the sheer density of bombs made coordination impossible. Streets were blocked by rubble, hoses severed by explosions. For the air crews above, the sight was staggering. From 15,000 feet, the city became a patchwork of flames, smoke columns rising and joining into a vast canopy. Some crews described the glow as so bright they could read their instruments without cockpit lights. A Wellington pilot remembered, "It was like looking into the mouth of a furnace." The whole city seemed on fire. The Germans fought back with everything they had. Flak batteries around Cologne unleashed thousands of shells, black puffs dotting the sky. Searchlights probed the darkness, occasionally catching a bomber and holding it steady until the gunners found their range. Crews jinked and weaved, dropping chaff like window was still months away, so survival depended on luck and evasive skill. Roughly 40 aircraft fell in flames that night, scattered across the countryside on the way in and out. For the men inside, there was little mercy. Few parachuted to safety, and many planes simply disintegrated under fire. Yet for every bomber lost, dozens pressed on. The timing worked almost perfectly. In the space of just 90 minutes, 868 aircraft dropped more than 1,400 tons of bombs, two-thirds incendiary. Cologne, with its medieval heart and densely packed housing, was a perfect target for fire. Whole neighbourhoods dissolved into flame. Witnesses later spoke of walls of fire racing down streets, roofs collapsing with roaring detonations, and people forced to flee through burning alleys. Inside the great Gothic cathedral, a small team of firemen fought desperately to save the structure. The landmark had been used by British navigators as a visual beacon. Harris himself had insisted it remain on target maps. Bombs fell close enough to shatter stained glass, but by miracle or chance, the cathedral stood amid the inferno, blackened but intact. Around it, entire districts were levelled. For civilians, the raid was chaos and terror. Shelters shook violently with each detonation. Some collapsed, burying families alive. Firestorms sucked oxygen from cellars, suffocating those who had sought safety underground. Above ground, people ran through burning streets, clutching children, searching for water or escape. One survivor recalled, "It was as though the world had ended. Everywhere was light and noise, fire and falling stone. We thought no one could live through it." By 2 o'clock, the last bombers had dropped their loads and turned for home. In their wake, Cologne was a city in ruins. More than 600 acres had been destroyed, nearly 1/4 of the built-up area. Over 45,000 people were left homeless. Factories, offices, schools and churches lay in rubble. The official death toll stood at around 469 killed, low compared to later firestorms, but devastating in psychological effect. Tens of thousands had seen their homes obliterated in a single night. As dawn broke on 31st May, smoke still poured skyward, visible for miles. Railway lines twisted, power stations shattered, and communications severed. German emergency crews, overwhelmed, poured in from neighbouring cities. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, admitted in his diary, "The English air terror has reached a new peak. The damage to Cologne is immense." For Bomber Command, the raid was a triumph. Nearly 900 bombers had struck, a scale no one had believed possible. The loss of 40 aircraft, less than 5%, was considered acceptable for such a massive operation. Harris had proved his point. With massed force, Britain could devastate a major German city in a single night. Newspapers the next morning blared headlines about the 1,000 bomber raid. Photos of Cologne's burning skyline circulated worldwide. In Cologne itself, the raid marked a turning point. The city had endured bombing before, but nothing on this scale. Civilians who had once trusted in shelters and fire brigades realized that no defense could withstand such concentrated assault. For many Germans, the Blitzkrieg had been reversed. What they had inflicted on London, Coventry and Rotterdam was now coming home in greater force. 90 minutes had changed everything. Morning light on 31st May 1942 revealed Cologne as a scarred ruin. Smoke drifted across the Rhine, fires still smouldered in gutted districts, and dazed civilians picked through the wreckage of their homes. Trams lay twisted on buckled rails, streets were cratered, and tens of thousands of people wandered in shock, clutching bundles of possessions. The raid had not only destroyed property, it had punctured the illusion that Germany's great cities could withstand the war untouched. News of the devastation reached Berlin quickly. Joseph Goebbels, the master of Nazi propaganda, recorded in his diary with rare candour, "The English air terror has reached a new peak. The damage to Cologne is immense. It is the greatest trial the German people have yet endured." Though official communiques tried to downplay the destruction, photographs and reports left no doubt. This was a new chapter in the war. The immediate Nazi response was fury. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had once boasted that no enemy aircraft would ever penetrate the Reich's skies. Now 1,000 had done so in a single night, and Cologne had burned while the Luftwaffe's night fighters shot down barely a handful of attackers. His prestige, already shaken after the failure to defeat Britain in 1940, took another humiliating blow. Göring raged at subordinates, demanded explanations from radar controllers, and promised swift retaliation. But beneath the bluster, the inadequacies of German air defence were clear. The night fighter system, so effective against smaller raids, had simply collapsed under the weight of numbers. General Joseph Kammhuber, architect of Germany's night defence, had designed a system of radar-directed boxes, each patrolled by fighters guided to individual bombers. Against streams of 50 or 100 aircraft, the system worked reasonably well. Against 1,000, it was overwhelmed. Radar screens lit up like storm clouds, indistinguishable targets merging into a single mass. Controllers could not pick out individuals, and the fighters, vectored into confusion, claimed only about a dozen kills. Cologne's flak gunners had fired tens of thousands of shells, but their effectiveness was diluted. A bomber stream meant that instead of facing bombers scattered over hours, they confronted hundreds in minutes. Guns overheated, crews exhausted themselves, and visibility dropped as the city below erupted in smoke and flames. German civilians noticed the difference immediately. In earlier raids, the defences had felt reassuring, searchlights slicing the sky, flak bursting around lone bombers. On the night of the 30th of May, the defences seemed powerless, firing blindly at an endless procession of aircraft. For Cologne's citizens, the shock was profound. Many had endured smaller raids stoically, comforted by faith in shelters and the Luftwaffe. But after the 1,000-bomber raid, confidence crumbled. Nearly 13,000 buildings were destroyed or badly damaged. Over 45,000 people were rendered homeless in a single night, an exodus of refugees trudging with carts and bicycles to neighbouring towns. Though the official death toll was under 500, the psychological toll was far greater. "We no longer felt safe," one survivor recalled decades later. "It was the night we realised the war had truly come to us." The Nazi leadership recognised the danger of defeatism. Goebbels's propaganda ministry launched an immediate campaign to reframe the raid. Newspapers described the attack as terror bombing, designed to break German morale rather than achieve military effect. Photographs emphasised the survival of landmarks, particularly Cologne Cathedral, which stood tall amidst the ruins. Stories circulated of heroic firemen saving cultural treasures, of civilians calmly enduring hardship. Yet beneath the rhetoric, unease spread. Rumours whispered that if Cologne could be struck so heavily, Berlin might be next. Strategically, the raid forced urgent reassessment. Göring and Kammhuber rushed to expand radar coverage and rethink night fighter tactics. The concept of the bomber stream, now understood, demanded countermeasures. Efforts began to concentrate flak batteries and increase fighter coordination. But these adjustments would take months, and in the meantime, German cities lay vulnerable. The Cologne raid also inflamed debates within the Nazi hierarchy about retaliation. Hitler demanded vengeance. Orders were drafted for renewed raids against British cities, but the Luftwaffe lacked the strength. Its bomber arm had been gutted by years of attrition and the demands of the Eastern Front. A handful of nuisance raids followed, but nothing on the scale of the Blitz. German civilians, promised revenge, saw little delivered. Among the population, morale wavered in complex ways. Some grew bitter and resentful of the regime, questioning its ability to defend them. Others hardened, vowing to endure whatever came. The propaganda line, that the RAF targeted civilians out of desperation, resonated with some, but many quietly acknowledged the truth. Britain now possessed the means to devastate German cities at will. Even outside Germany, shockwaves spread. Neutral observers in Switzerland and Sweden reported astonishment at the raid's scale. In occupied Europe, whispers circulated that the Allies had found the weapon to break the Reich. In the United States, headlines hailed Britain's feat, reinforcing the promise of Anglo-American cooperation in air power. For the RAF, Cologne was proof of concept. For Germany, it was an alarm bell. One raid did not cripple the Reich, but it demonstrated what might come if Harris's vision of mass bombing became routine. In Berlin, Goebbels admitted privately, "If the English are able to repeat such raids often, we will face grave consequences." Cologne was not yet Dresden, not yet Hamburg, but it was a beginning. The 1,000-bomber raid had shown that no German city was safe. It was a prophecy of the firestorms still to come. In the early hours of 31st May 1942, as the surviving bombers of the Great Cologne raid returned across the Channel, Britain waited anxiously. At dawn, the first signals reached Bomber Command headquarters at High Wycombe. Losses were far lower than expected, and crews reported massive fires raging in Cologne. Arthur Harris, chain-smoking in his office, allowed himself a rare smile. His gamble had paid off. By mid-morning, the results were clear. Out of more than 1,000 bombers dispatched, only 40 were lost, a casualty rate of under 5%. Given the scale of the operation, this was astonishingly low. Harris, who had staked his reputation on the feasibility of mass raids, immediately pressed the point. If Cologne could be hit like this, other German cities could follow. The bomber offensive had proven itself at last. News travelled fast. The Air Ministry wasted no time in publicising the achievement. That Sunday, newspapers carried banner headlines. Cologne blitzed by 1,000 bombers. The BBC broadcast triumphant bulletins, describing the raid as the largest in history. Though details of damage were sketchy, journalists emphasised the precision, scale and daring of the operation. For a British public still battered by rationing, setbacks overseas and nightly alarms, this was electrifying. The people who had endured the Blitz could now read that their tormentors were themselves experiencing destruction on an unimaginable scale. Across the country, the mood lifted. Civilians in London, Coventry and Liverpool, whose own homes had been shattered by German bombs, savoured the thought of Cologne in ruins. It was like a weight lifted, one diarist wrote. For once we were not the victims, but the victors. In pubs, in factories and on buses, people repeated the words, 1,000 bombers, with pride. Even Churchill, usually cautious about over-promising from the air war, told Parliament that Cologne has been largely destroyed, adding with deliberate emphasis, we shall pursue this method with increasing force. Bomber Command air crews, too, felt vindicated. Many had endured months of gruelling, dangerous operations with little visible impact. Losses in 1941 had been high, accuracy poor and morale fragile. Now, at last, they had demonstrated the destructive power Harris always claimed for them. Veterans recalled the raid as a turning point. When we heard the numbers and saw the fires, one pilot said, we knew we'd made history. The raid's propaganda value extended overseas. In Washington, the American press gave the story prominent coverage, hailing it as proof of Britain's resilience and the bombers' potential. American leaders, already preparing for their own heavy bomber campaign, saw in Cologne a template for what massed air power might achieve. It gave renewed justification for the production of thousands of B-17 and B-24s, and lent credibility to the combined bomber offensive later agreed at Casablanca in 1943. Behind the celebration, however, practical realities intruded. The 1,000 bomber raid had required immense effort, pulling aircraft from training units and operational conversion flights to fill out the numbers. Harris knew he could not repeat such feats nightly. Yet he also knew that American production promised to change the equation. With US factories producing aircraft on a scale Britain alone could never achieve, the 1,000-bomber raid was not a one-off stunt, but a glimpse of the future. In Bomber Command's war rooms, staff pored over after-action reports. The bomber stream tactic, massing aircraft in tight succession to overwhelm German defences, had proven spectacularly effective. Pathfinder units, dropping flares to mark the target, had greatly improved accuracy. The lessons of Cologne would be applied again, in raids against Essen, Bremen and Hamburg. Harris was already planning the next blows. Yet the raid also reignited debate. Some in Britain's leadership remained sceptical of Harris's single-minded faith in bombing. Critics in the RAF and government questioned whether destroying German cities would truly shorten the war, or whether the resources might be better spent elsewhere, on fighters, shipping or armies. But Cologne gave Harris political cover. It was difficult to argue against results so dramatic, especially when morale at home soared. The raid's symbolic power was immense. Cologne, an ancient Rhine city, had been one of the jewels of Germany, a place of cathedrals, universities, and commerce. That Britain could strike it with such ferocity carried psychological weight. Harris seized on this in speeches and memos, framing Cologne as the first in a series of major blows that would grind down German industry and spirit. His phrase, dehousing the German worker, removing civilian morale through mass destruction of homes, gained traction among some planners, though it remained controversial. For ordinary Britons, the details mattered less than the sense of momentum. After years of defensive struggle, the initiative seemed finally to be shifting. Families huddled around radios, hearing announcers speak of the immense devastation in Cologne. The BBC played recordings of returning air crews, their clipped voices describing vast sheets of flame and hundreds of fires. It sounded like retribution, justice for the Blitz. Even so, some in Britain viewed the raid with unease. Religious leaders questioned the morality of targeting cities, warning that deliberate attacks on civilians risked eroding Britain's moral standing. Letters to newspapers expressed both pride and discomfort. "I rejoice that the Hun now suffers," one correspondent wrote, "yet I wonder if this is the path to peace." Such doubts would grow louder as bombing intensified, but in June 1942, celebration drowned out hesitation. Cologne entered British popular culture almost immediately. Cartoonists drew caricatures of dazed Germans amid rubble. Popular songs referenced the Cologne Express. Harris himself, though disliked by some colleagues, was lionized in the press as Butcher or Bomber Harris, epithets he accepted with grim satisfaction. To his mind, terror and destruction were the only language the Nazis understood. Above all, Cologne proved a rallying point. It was invoked in speeches, in recruitment drives, and in Allied conferences as evidence that air power could strike deep into the Reich. For a nation still waiting for the second front in Europe, bombing raids provided the only direct way of hitting Germany. The 1,000-bomber raid gave people the assurance that Britain was not merely enduring, but fighting back, and fighting effectively. Looking back, historians agree that Cologne was less important for the physical damage inflicted than for its psychological impact. The city was badly hit, but not destroyed. Industrial production, though disrupted, recovered quickly. Yet the raid's true significance lay in demonstrating possibility, that the RAF could mass overwhelming force, deliver it deep inside Germany, and return with tolerable losses. It was a dress rehearsal for the devastation to come. As June 1942 began, Britain celebrated with newfound confidence. The Germans had not been invincible. Cologne had burned, and Bomber Command had delivered. In Harris's words, "This is only the beginning. We can destroy Germany city by city, factory by factory, until they surrender or die." For the first time since 1940, the British public could believe him. On the morning of 31st May 1942, Cologne awoke to silence, broken only by the crackle of burning timber, the hiss of ruptured gas mains, and the distant clatter of fire brigades still fighting isolated blazes. The city's residents stumbled out of shelters to find familiar streets reduced to jagged silhouettes. Where entire rows of houses had stood, only smoking walls remained. The 1,000-bomber raid had lasted only 90 minutes, but its effects would scar Cologne for years. The statistics only partly told the story. Nearly 13,000 homes and buildings were destroyed or badly damaged. Around 45,000 people, almost 1 in 10 of the city's population, were left homeless overnight. The official death toll, just under 500, seemed surprisingly low compared to the scale of devastation, but this number disguised the profound trauma. Families separated in the chaos could not find each other for days. Thousands were injured, many grievously, with burns, blast wounds and broken bones overwhelming the city's hospitals. Cologne's civil defence services had been caught off guard. Fire brigades rushed from blaze to blaze, but the sheer number of fires, set alight by incendiaries dropped across a concentrated area, proved impossible to contain. Water pressure collapsed in several districts as mains burst under the bombardment. Volunteer air raid wardens, many themselves homeless, tried to guide survivors to emergency shelters, but the displacement was vast. Train stations were crammed with families clutching bundles, waiting to be evacuated to rural areas. One survivor, interviewed decades later, recalled the sensory shock. The whole city glowed red. The air was full of smoke and grit. We heard children crying, animals screaming in their pens, people calling names in the dark. For many, the experience destroyed their faith in the Nazi regime's promises of security. Cologne had been bombed before, but never like this. The destruction of infrastructure deepened the crisis. Tram lines were mangled, roads cratered, telephone lines severed. Cologne's utilities struggled to restore power and water. In some neighbourhoods, survivors melted snow or collected rainwater in buckets. Food distribution faltered as bakeries, warehouses and shops burned. Within days, ration queues snaked for blocks. Symbolically, the raid left enduring images. Photographs circulated of Cologne Cathedral, standing blackened but largely unscathed amid a sea of rubble. Nazi propaganda seized on this, presenting it as a miracle, proof that German spirit endured. But to civilians who had lost everything, the intact cathedral offered little consolation. "What use was the cathedral?" one woman asked bitterly, "when my house, my husband and my children are gone?" The Luftschutz, civil defence, authorities scrambled to manage the aftermath. Emergency billeting schemes placed tens of thousands of homeless in schools, churches and public buildings. Others were evacuated to rural villages along the Rhine. Trains carried children to foster homes far from the city, a bitter echo of Britain's own wartime evacuations. Many evacuees never returned, their lives permanently uprooted by one night of bombing. Industrial targets in Cologne also suffered, though less than Allied intelligence hoped. The Ford Motor Factory and major chemical plants sustained damage, but most resumed operations within weeks. German reports acknowledged temporary production losses, but emphasized resilience. Still, the disruption was real. Machinery destroyed, workers displaced, supply lines interrupted. The raid demonstrated that even if individual factories survived, the surrounding infrastructure could be paralyzed. Cultural life in Cologne, a city proud of its music, art and learning, also took a blow. Libraries lost irreplaceable manuscripts. Churches and schools were gutted. Centuries-old neighbourhoods, with timbered houses dating back to the Middle Ages, vanished in hours. The fabric of the city, its heritage, its sense of place, was torn apart as surely as its factories. Psychologically, the raid's impact rippled far beyond Cologne. Refugees spread stories across Germany, describing walls of fire and rivers of flame. Though official propaganda framed the attack as terror bombing, many Germans privately conceded that the Allies had discovered a new level of destructive capability. The contrast with earlier raids was stark. Cologne had not been harassed, it had been devastated in a single overwhelming stroke. The Nazi regime attempted to restore morale with displays of resilience. Hitler ordered rapid reconstruction efforts, though materials were scarce and labour stretched thin. Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda orchestrated press tours, photographing workers clearing rubble, women cooking in makeshift kitchens, and children smiling despite adversity. Yet these images could not erase the sense of vulnerability. As one diarist wrote, "If Cologne can burn, so can Berlin." For Cologne's citizens, daily life became an exercise in endurance. Nights were spent in shelters, days in queues or rubble-clearing brigades. Families lived in overcrowded lodgings or makeshift huts on the city's outskirts. School children studied in church basements, The rhythm of urban life, commuting, shopping, attending concerts, was shattered. Every siren triggered waves of panic, reminders that another night like 30 May could come at any time. The raid also left invisible wounds. Survivors carried psychological scars, fear of loud noises, recurring nightmares, survivor's guilt. Many children who endured the Cologne bombing later described it as the defining memory of their childhoods. Even decades later, they could recall the heat of the flames, the roar of collapsing buildings, the taste of ash. From the Allied perspective, Cologne's suffering was both a means and an end. The raid had been intended as demonstration and experiment, to test tactics, prove scale, and deliver a shock. In that sense, it succeeded. But for the people of Cologne, it was not strategy, but catastrophe. Their city had become the proving ground for a new age of warfare, industrialized destruction delivered in concentrated doses. Cologne would endure many more raids in the years to come, but none carried quite the same shock as the 1,000-bomber night of May 1942. That first great onslaught marked the end of any illusion that the city, or Germany itself, could be spared the full weight of Allied air power. The toll was measured not just in ruins and refugees, but in a creeping realization. The war was now total, and nowhere was safe. The 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne was not merely a tactical success. It was a turning point that forced both the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe to rethink their strategies in the air war. Cologne had shown what massed heavy bombers could achieve in a single night, but it had also revealed the limits, risks, and costs of such operations. Both sides emerged from the raid with lessons that would shape the conflict for the next 3 years. For Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, Cologne was vindication. Since taking command of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942, he had argued that concentrated large-scale bombing could cripple German industry and morale. Critics had doubted him, pointing to poor accuracy, heavy bomber losses, and limited resources. But Cologne had silenced many doubters. British newspapers celebrated the raid as a triumph. Headlines declared, "Cologne blitzed by 1,000 planes," and RAF strikes with new might. Harris himself issued a public statement. The German people sowed the wind. Now they are going to reap the whirlwind. In the weeks after Cologne, he pushed for more 1,000-bomber raids. Essen, Bremen, and Düsseldorf soon followed, though none matched Cologne in shock value. Behind the rhetoric, Bomber Command's planners studied the raid carefully. Reports confirmed that the bomber stream tactic, channeling aircraft along a narrow path, overwhelming German radar and fighters, had worked brilliantly. Losses were only 40 aircraft, less than 5% of the force, far below predictions. The raid proved that concentrated weight of numbers could overcome defences. Yet Harris also recognised the limitations. Cologne had been possible only by stripping training units and squadrons from across Britain. Sustaining such mass raids regularly would take time, especially with the demand for bombers increasing in North Africa and the Far East. The real hope lay in the future. The new 4-engine heavies, Lancasters, Halifaxes and Stirlings, coming off British production lines in growing numbers. Cologne had been the prototype. Within a year, Harris hoped such raids would become routine. For the Germans, Cologne was a nightmare and a challenge. The raid had exposed the weaknesses of the Kammhuber line, the carefully designed belt of radar and night fighter zones across occupied Europe. General Josef Kammhuber had built his system around precision control, guiding fighters one by one to intercept individual bombers. Against 100 aircraft, the system worked. Against 1,000, it collapsed. In the aftermath, Kammhuber pressed for reforms. He proposed massing fighters into Wildsau, wild boar tactics, where groups of night fighters attacked bomber streams directly rather than waiting for radar guidance. He also pushed for more radar, faster aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Ju 88, and better searchlights to pierce the bomber streams. But resources were limited. The Luftwaffe's bomber force was already stretched thin on the Eastern Front. Fighter production was focused on daylight defense against the Americans, who were ramping up raids with their B-17 flying fortresses. Cologne underscored a harsh truth. Germany would have to defend its skies against two very different threats: RAF night raids and USAF daylight raids, often simultaneously. Strategically, Cologne marked the beginning of a psychological campaign as much as a physical one. Harris believed bombing could erode German morale to the point of collapse. Cologne seemed to confirm it. Tens of thousands homeless, industrial output disrupted, fear spreading through the civilian population. British intelligence reports noted widespread panic, especially among refugees. Yet German morale proved more resilient than Harris hoped. Goebbels's propaganda machine reframed the raid as evidence of Allied desperation. Survivors were portrayed as stoic victims of terror bombing. Nazi radio broadcasts emphasized the survival of Cologne Cathedral as a symbol of endurance. At the same time, the regime used the raid to harden hatred of Britain, encouraging civilians to see themselves as frontline soldiers in a total war. Still, the psychological crack was visible. Diaries and letters captured despair. If they can do this once, they can do it again. How long can we live like this? The seeds of defeatism planted in Cologne would grow as more cities burned. Cologne also intensified debates within the Allied leadership. In Washington, American observers studied the raid with fascination. The U.S. Army Air Forces, still building its strength in Europe, remained committed to precision daylight bombing, targeting factories with Norden bomb sites. But some wondered whether Harris's area bombing approach, obliterating entire districts, was more effective. The controversy would simmer until the combined bomber offensive of 1943, when American daylight raids and British night raids became complementary parts of a single strategy. Meanwhile, within Britain, Cologne muted many critics of Harris. For months, voices inside the Air Ministry had questioned whether bombers were a waste compared to fighters or the army. Cologne gave Harris breathing space. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had always supported bombing as a means of hitting Germany directly, hailed the raid as a remarkable achievement of organisation and courage. In hindsight, Cologne was not militarily decisive. The city's factories resumed production within weeks. Civil defence measures improved. German industry was far from crippled. But Cologne mattered because it marked a new phase of the war, the demonstration that Allied air power could deliver destruction on a scale unimaginable only months before. For the RAF, the raid was a promise of what was to come once resources grew. For Germany, it was a warning that no city was safe, no matter how deep in the Reich. The strategic bombing campaign was still young, but Cologne had shown its potential. As one German officer admitted in a post-war interrogation, Cologne was the beginning. After that, we knew the war would not spare our homes. We could win battles in Russia, but in Germany we would face the bombers, and the bombers would never stop. When historians look back at the night of the 30th to the 31st of May 1942, they see not just a single raid, but the opening act of a new kind of warfare. The 1,000-bomber attack on Cologne did not destroy Germany's ability to fight, nor did it break the morale of its people in one stroke. Yet its legacy stretched far beyond the rubble and ash. It reshaped the conduct of the air war, redefined the balance between Britain and Germany, and left scars, material and psychological, that endured long after the war ended. For Bomber Command, Cologne was a template. The raid validated tactics, technology, and organizational methods that became standard in the campaign of 1943–45. The bomber stream, which had so effectively saturated German defences, became the norm. Pathfinder squadrons, using flares and target indicators to guide the main force, were expanded and refined, and the use of incendiaries in mass to ignite firestorms was studied and repeated. Harris and his staff recognized that Cologne was a beginning, not an end. As more Lancasters, Halifaxes and Stirlings entered service, raids of Cologne's magnitude became achievable without stripping training units. By mid-1943, the RAF could launch 1,000-bomber raids repeatedly, culminating in the Hamburg firestorm of July 1943 and the long assault on Berlin in 1943–44. Cologne had been the proof of concept. The cities that followed were the execution. For the German defenders, Cologne was equally formative. The shock forced a re-evaluation of the Reich's air defences. Radar nets were strengthened, night fighter tactics adapted, and civilian defence expanded. The wild sow tactic, sending fighters to prowl bomber streams under illuminated skies, was developed in direct response to the Cologne experience. But Cologne also revealed Germany's dilemma. No matter how the Luftwaffe improved, it was fighting against time and numbers. Even as defences grew stronger, Allied bomber production surged higher. Cologne was the first indication that German skies would be filled not by dozens or hundreds, but by thousands of aircraft night after night until the end of the war. The legacy of Cologne for its people was measured in more than statistics. Thousands of families displaced by the raid never returned to their pre-war homes. Some emigrated after the war, others lived in temporary housing well into the 1950s. Entire neighbourhoods, once centuries old, were rebuilt in modern concrete rather than restored, changing the city's character permanently. Psychologically, Cologne's citizens bore the burden of being the first to experience destruction on such a scale. Survivors often described a sense of disbelief, that a single raid could obliterate so much. Post-war oral histories reveal recurring trauma, the sound of sirens triggering panic, the smell of smoke bringing back memories of that night. For children, the raid was formative. Many later recalled it as the moment they understood the war was unwinnable. At the strategic level, Cologne altered Allied planning. The Americans, impressed by the raid's scale, pressed ahead with their own build-up in Britain. When US bombers began daylight operations later in 1942, they did so with the confidence that massed bombing could deliver results. The round-the-clock bombing strategy, Americans by day, British by night, owed much to Cologne's demonstration that mass raids were sustainable. Politically, Cologne strengthened Churchill's hand. At a time when Britain was still waiting for a second front in Europe, bombing provided a visible, dramatic means of striking at Germany. Cologne's headlines reassured both the British public and anxious allies that Britain was not passive. In Moscow, Stalin, impatient for Western action, cited the raid as evidence that Britain was finally carrying its weight. Cologne also ignited moral debate that would intensify as the bombing campaign escalated. The deliberate targeting of an entire city raised uncomfortable questions about civilian casualties. In Parliament and the press, a few voices asked whether Britain risked becoming as ruthless as its enemy. The Archbishop of Canterbury publicly questioned the morality of area bombing, even as Harris insisted it was the only way to end the war. This debate never fully silenced the campaign, but it foreshadowed post-war controversies. Cologne was the first clear case where the line between military and civilian targets blurred beyond recognition. In later years, as Hamburg, Dresden, and other cities burned, the shadow of Cologne lingered as the moment Britain crossed into total war from the air. Symbolically, Cologne became shorthand for British retaliation. For those who had endured the Blitz, the raid was catharsis. For the Germans, it was a warning of what was to come. In propaganda, both sides used the city as emblem. The RAF called it the beginning of the end. Goebbels insisted it proved British barbarity. In the city itself, Cologne Cathedral, surviving amid the ruins, became a symbol of endurance. To some Germans, its survival was divine providence, to others, bitter irony. Allied airmen flying over the city in later raids often used the cathedral spire as a navigation point, a landmark that endured even as everything around it was flattened. By war's end, Cologne had been bombed 262 times. 90% of the city lay in ruins. The 1,000-bomber raid was only the beginning. Yet it remained distinct in memory because it was first, sudden, and overwhelming. Survivors spoke of that night as a rupture, the moment life before the war ended forever, and survival became daily struggle. In post-war Germany, Cologne became a case study in reconstruction. The city's ruins were cleared with enormous effort, sometimes using women's labour brigades known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. By the 1950s, Cologne was rebuilt in modern form, but the memory of 1942 lingered in monuments, plaques, and annual commemorations. In Britain, the raid entered history as Harris intended, proof of the bomber's power. Yet with time, the triumphal tone softened. Historians began to ask not just what Cologne achieved, but what it cost, not only in lives lost, but in moral capital. Today, the raid is remembered both as a milestone of military innovation and as a harbinger of the terrible destruction that strategic bombing would unleash on Europe and Japan. The 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne was a paradox. Militarily, its immediate effect was limited, but strategically, it was enormous. It proved that air power could be applied on a scale never before imagined. It reshaped Allied and German strategy alike. It lifted British morale and seeded German despair. And it marked the transition to a total air war where entire cities became battlefields. Cologne's legacy, then, was not just in its ruins, but in the future it foretold: Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Tokyo. The age of mass destruction from the skies had begun, and Cologne was its grim herald,